Join me to paint this beautiful shell using watercolors. I'm painting the Junonia shell in two different ways, one with a loose painting method and other with a structured approach using a sketch. I have split this video into two parts. In part 1, we will explore loose painting. There is no sketch, just enjoying the process as I guide you step by step. In part 2, you will also enjoy the process but with a sketch to guide the painting. I am using a very light value of indigo to paint the outline of the shell just to establish its structure. It has an elongated shape, somewhat like an eye, with one end tapering into a V shape. You can see in the video how I'm forming this shape, and I hope it becomes easier as you watch the painting process. After painting the outline, I wet the area with clear water before the outline dries. This helps the outline blend softly into the painting rather than standing out too much. Ensure there is no pool of water after wetting the area. If you find there is too much water, tilt the board and use a damp brush to absorb the excess. Next, I use a medium value of indigo to paint the shadowed part of the shell. As I move towards the middle, I lighten the value. The right side is where the light falls, so I leave it untouched even though it's still wet. In the reference image at the top of the shell, you can see a small vest. To capture that, I paint that curved lines on the top of the shell. Next, I mix burnt umber with a small amount of indigo to paint the specks on the shell. We are using the wet on wet technique but with more control so the pigment stays in place and create perfect specks on the shell. While I was starting to wet the outlined area, I wet the paper and re-wet it a couple of times to keep it moist for a long time. Now the paper is evenly damp with no puddles, so when I apply the paint in a thick consistency, it doesn't spread too much, allowing me to create a beautiful pattern. If you look closely, you will notice that the spots on the left side of the shell are larger, and as they move towards the right, they gradually get smaller. Also, the spots follow a slight upward curve as they move along the shell's surface. I didn't follow the exact pattern or shape of the speckles on the shell. I just painted them intuitively. I simply gave them a slight upward curve and gradually made them smaller as they moved from left to right. That's the effect I aimed for my painting to capture the specks on the shell. Using a mix of burnt umber with a small amount of indigo, I paint the top part of the shell and define the curved grooves as well. Next, I mix burnt umber with small amount of indigo, and using light value of that mix, I paint the aperture of the shell. As I reach the bottom of the aperture, I gradually reduce the value completely. Then I add a medium value to the left of the aperture to define its shadowed area. Now, using a value between a darker and medium value, I add the speckles visible on the aperture. The spots on the aperture are softer and more diffused compared to the bold, well defined spots on the main body of the shell. They appear lighter and less distinct due to the way light interacts with the outer surface of the aperture. So use a lighter value than the bold spots on the main body. Next, we have to define the outer lip of the aperture. To do this, I lift the pigment near the edges. I also add some dark spots using a darker value along the outer lip. I use a clean, damp brush to lift the pigment along the edges to define the outer lip of the aperture. Next, I'm painting the shadow of this shell. For that, I'm wetting the shadow area. Normally, we can use clean water, but since it wouldn't be visible to you, I'm using a light value of burnt umber to indicate the dampened area. I make sure there is no excess water or puddles on the shadow area. If you find any puddles, you can use a damp brush to absorb them. The shadow we are creating roughly follows the shape of the shell. I tilt the board for convenience while painting the shadow. I'm using indigo mixed with small amount of burnt umber to paint the shadow. While painting the shadow with indigo, make sure to paint inside the dampened area so that the pigment softly diffuses at the edges. Since my paper started drying, I got some hard edges. To fix this, I gently run a damp brush over the edges for a smooth transition. I also deepen the shadow slightly right under the shell for adding more depth. And with that, the shell is complete, painted entirely without a sketch. Painting without a sketch can be tricky. You can use this image to trace the outline. It will make the process easier and more enjoyable. First, I wet the main part of the shell. Then, using a light value of indigo, I paint the shadowed areas. The paper shouldn't have any puddles. If there is excess water, use a damp brush to absorb it. Next, I mix burnt umber with small amount of indigo, which is used to paint on the shadowed area as shown in the video. Next, I mix burnt umber with small amount of indigo to create a rich dark tone for the speckles. I use this mix in a thick consistency, meaning there is very little water in the pigment. This helps the spots stay in place without spraying too much. Next, I'm painting the aperture of the shell using a light value of burnt umber. While the paint is still wet, I gently layer a slightly deeper shade between light and medium value to create a soft shadows inside the aperture. The paper is still wet on the aperture area, so now I'm adding speckles using a mix of burnt umber with a small amount of indigo. These speckles should be slightly lighter in value compared to the bold spots on the main part of the shell. Be careful at this stage, the pigment should stay in place without spreading too much. I'm adding a dark value near the edges of the aperture. You can check the reference picture to see where the darker areas should go. Then, using the lifting technique, I gently remove some paint along the edges, creating the appearance of the outer lip of the aperture. Next, I'm wetting the shadow area of the shell that we have already sketched and slightly extending the dampened area beyond the sketch. Then I apply a light value of burnt umber inside the sketched area. After that, I use a medium value of indigo, which is applied within the sketch so that the pigment spreads naturally, creating a soft diffusion effect and preventing any formation of hard edges. Finally, I add a dark value near the shell in the shadow area to create more depth. We have finished painting a beautiful shell. Hope you enjoyed the process. See you in another video. Until then, take care and bye bye from Prema.